This is Tokens. I'm Lee C. Camp.
Historically, the priest or the pastor was called the cure animum, the cure of souls. Their job was like the healing and the shepherding and the care and the companionship of the soul on its journey to healing in God. So I guess I'm trying to get back to that more kind of ancient vision of what it means to be a pastor.
That's today's guest, John Mark Comer, founder of Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon. Following that ancient vision of being a pastor, John Mark comes to transformation from an angle too little discussed.
Hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life in our day. You must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life.
Today we discuss John Mark's 2019 book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry.
Most people are too busy to live emotionally healthy and spiritually vibrant lives. Most people are anxious, burned out. They know that they're addicted to their phone and the internet and Netflix, but they're trying to get off of it. They feel lonely, but yet they struggle in relationships and in actual intimacy and community and church.
And we also cover why willpower will not and cannot do what we want it to do, recovering nonviolence as a central Christian practice, the quest for happiness, and his most recent book and New York Times bestseller, Live No Lies. I know, you're wondering, how could you possibly do so much in one interview? Well, stick around and you'll see it's coming right up. John Mark Comer is founding pastor of Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon, which I understand is right next to Powell's bookstore, which makes me all the more reason to get out there soon. Married to T, has 3 children, is the author of 6 books, 2 of which we'll discuss today, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, and his newest book entitled Live No Lies. Welcome, John Mark.
So happy to be along. Thanks for having me.
Grateful to have you here in Middle Tennessee.
Actually, I know this Nashville's growing on me. I see the appeal. Like we hear all these rumor stories of people leaving the coast for Nashville.
Yeah, we hope that you will not tell anybody else on the West Coast about the appeal of Nashville.
I feel like if you wanted to buy a house here or whatever, you missed the window.
Yes, you
missed the glory days
a couple of years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, those of us who've been here for a while are very thankful we did buy some years ago rather than now.
It is charming. This part, what do you call this part of the city?
We're in Green Hills.
Green Hills. Yeah, it is charming. I mean, it feels like the best of the South.
Yeah, it's a very wonderful city. We've seen it grow in incredible ways.
Yeah, you've been here a long time, huh?
Yeah, I've been back here 23 years. But the city skyline is completely different than it was 15 years ago. Yeah. And remarkable. But,
yeah, somebody called it the third coast yesterday when I was with them, because so many people moving here from New York and California and Portland. And, yeah, interesting kind of mix of like coastal, more liberal culture, but you're very much in the South.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So you're
definitely in the South.
Yeah.
But yeah, Nashville itself, I mean, even in terms of politics, Nashville's different than a lot of parts of the state. But you definitely have the kind of Southern hospitality, Southern charm that's still quite appealing. And
yeah, coming from, there's so much, like, such a spirit of contempt in some of the West Coast cities. You really pick up the culture of honor thing here, which is like non-existent where I'm from, you know?
Yeah.
So just the way people say hello, sir, the lack of graffiti everywhere is is shocking to me. I'm used to just seeing garbage and graffiti everywhere.
That's
and so it's just so clean. Which, graffiti is a form of dishonor, intentional dishonor. Honor culture is really fascinating to me because I've never lived in one. So it's very noticeable to an outsider.
Yeah, that's remarkable, because certainly honor culture has its dark side in the sense that it can give, famously to all sorts of passive-aggressive behavior.
Yes.
But that being said, there's something that's beautiful about Southern mores in the sense that you speak to people and you look them in the eye.
Yes.
And you treat them with respect. I tell some of my students sometimes, who will sometimes joke about that sort of stuff, that they should not take lightly the fact that a kind word spoken may be the only act of love a lot of people receive in a day. And it's no small matter to treat people with that kind of kindness. So, well, hey, I'm really excited about the stuff that we might get to talk about today. It seems to me, in thinking about what I know about some of your work, I see you maybe taking a lot of historic wisdom traditions, or what in moral philosophy we would call virtue traditions, as well as kind of findings in neuroscience or social psychology, as well as a third piece laid over that of the Christian tradition, and looking at kind of the overlap of those three. But is that a fair way to kind of summarize some of the stuff that you're up to?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a equal parts Venn diagram.
Yeah.
I think I come to all of it through the pathway of discipleship or spiritual formation. But very interested, yes, in the historic wisdom tradition and the contemporary one, and in the best of the social sciences or psychology. And part of that is just, I feel like in the Enlightenment, the soul got kind of split. You would understand better than I the kind of etymology of academic subdisciplines, how my understanding is, and correct me here if I'm way off, that prior to kind of some of the modern university system, most public intellectuals were broader in their field of study.
Yeah.
And as the university system developed and the Enlightenment kind of split the mind from the body, we developed academic subdisciplines, which I'm sure there's so many pros to that. But one of the cons is somehow in that breakup, psychology and the kind of domain of the soul went to Freud and his ilk, who are thoroughly anti-Christian, and like their worldview is both scientifically disproven now and deeply at odds with, the wisdom of Jesus. But whether that's from a psychologist or a, wisdom tradition, or I'm currently reading a Buddhist right now, and I'm like, half of the stuff I think is absolutely errant, and the other half I'm like, that's really helpful,
You've publicly stated your indebtedness to Dallas Willard a lot. What would you say would be the one or two key insights from him that got you taking his work seriously?
Honestly, much of my work is just an attempt to popularize his teaching. He was kind of my gateway drug into all things spiritual formation. I think his emphasis on and his philosophical or psychological or spiritual kind of understanding of the why behind what some call the spiritual disciplines, what I prefer to call the practices of Jesus, was revolutionary for me. His breadth of understanding of the Christian tradition being this deep and wide. He and Richard Foster really tried to reintroduce to evangelicals and Protestants in America that we're part of a tradition that's much deeper and wider and broader than most of us realize.
And lots of things that can be appreciated
and
from
lots
other
of
streams
things.
of the tradition.
Yes, exactly. And then third, probably his loving but firm engagement with secular culture. So unlike a lot of other people in the formation movement, he was a philosopher at the University of Southern California. So one of the problems with a lot of the spiritual formation writers is most of them are baby boomers who spent their life in conservative church culture. So like one of the first things when you start to take formation seriously that you have to deal with is people's images of God and false images of God, because you become like your image of God for better or for worse. Yeah. And so if you imagine God as an angry kind of right-wing yelling at all the, like whatever, then you're going to become like that. The problem is that, pastoring on the West Coast my whole life and now being in Portland, for every person in my church that has like an image of God who's mad at them, there's probably 250 people that think of God as their like cosmic yoga sex coach. So it's the same problem. People have a false image of God that is distorting their behavior. But if, to stereotype from my parents' generation, it was a God who's mad and so they're screaming at the gay people. Yeah. For my generation, it's like God just wants me to be happy, so I'm sleeping with my girlfriend before going to the Pride Parade. It's the same problem. It's just expressed differently generationally, culturally, whether you're in Portland or wherever.
It reminds me of one of my theology seminars at Notre Dame when I was in grad school, where one of the professors said, it was probably 7 or 8 of us, she said, how many of you had this vision in Christian formation when you were young of fear of going to hell? And I'm thinking, didn't everybody have that? There were 2 or 3 of us out of the 7 that raised our hands. And but yeah, it's terribly important to realize that the false visions of who God is are multiform. And,
across the spectrum. Yeah. Yep. So, his proximity to secular narratives by just virtue of being a philosopher at the University of Southern California was really a gift. One of the last books he wrote that almost nobody's read, it's a weird title, it's Knowing Christ Today, which was the popular kind of, it's an easy book to read, version of the academic contribution he made that was published after his death, The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. is just a fascinating take. So I think probably those three things, like the concept of spiritual formation, which was language that was brand new to me a number of years ago, and the role of practices and inner healing in your journey toward Christ-likeness. Secondly, the breadth of the Christian tradition. And third, engaging with secular culture. Because similar to false images of God, we all live from these narrative assumptions about what's good and true and beautiful. Right. And so, Philip Rieff, the sociologist of religion, he has that great line about how the best way to critique secular culture is to biopsy it. I really like that word picture. If you think of, if you're a doctor and you suspect that possibly part of somebody's body is cancerous, you biopsy it. You take a little section, you cut it out, you put it under a microscope, and you hold it up to the light, and you just analyze it. What's there? What's in it? Where does it come from? Where's it going? So to do that with secular culture, I will do this a lot in my teaching, and I try to do it in like a kind of dispassionate, almost like a journalist more than like a fiery preacher. You don't have to yell or scream, because that will often just activate people's defense mechanisms or identities. But just kind of take a little, it could be on the right, it could be Make America Great Again, or All Lives Matter. On the left, it could be Genders Between the Ears, Not the Legs, or whatever, Love is Love. You can just take a little slogan or something like that and biopsy it. Where does this come from? Like, let's just look at this. Where does this idea come from? Is there an ideology behind it? Is there a background to it? Is there a philosopher that started this? And where does this possibly go? Could we think about the telos of this kind of an ideology? What you're really getting people to do is kind of observe, analyze, and question their assumptions about the good, the true, and the beautiful.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I've not heard that, the biopsy analogy. That's very helpful. So when you think about key practices, what have been key practices that you all have focused upon in your local church life there in Portland?
Well, we've spent the last couple of years kind of rebuilding our church around a rule of life and exploring this idea of what if a rule of life is to churches of the future what membership was to churches of the past, under Christendom. Now, if you think about rule of life, when did it really rise to prominence? It's much older than this, but really with Benedict, as the Roman Empire is falling into decline and disarray, and as chaos is mounting in the world, the movement was toward kind of order. Not order, that word's been politicized in the last couple of years. I don't mean it in that kind of a American politics way, but order, a sense of what the ancients called stabilitas, stability, a peace, a kind of a life based on rhythms of prayer and community together. So I think we're in a cultural moment of like anxiety is through the roof, both at mental illness level and just at an ambient cultural level. There's this sense of like chaos in the culture right now. And so I think part of the impulse of this, the Spirit is always kind of zigging, I think, where culture is zagging. You know what I mean? Like the move of the Spirit's almost always a counter move to the more nefarious movements of culture. And so I think part of what the Spirit is moving toward right now is kind of a rule of life concept. So for us, there's some of the traditional evangelical ones that I grew up with, such as church on Sunday, morning prayer, and scripture reading, which we very much held to, though often, we've taken another look at how we read scripture more slowly and prayerfully and more through the lens of kind of Psalm 1 meditation, whether you call that Lectio Divina or just call it reading prayerfully, whatever. But then new practices or disciplines that I did not really grow up with, such as Sabbath, fasting has actually played a very key role in my own formation and that of our church, which is a really interesting one. Most Western people, first off, don't realize that fasting was core to the Christian tradition until very recently. It's one of only 3 spiritual disciplines that Jesus names. For the early church, for arguably 1,000 years, it was just assumed that you would fast every Friday and every Wednesday. Lent used to be like Ramadan, where you'd fast until sunset for 40 days every single year.
I didn't know that part, yeah.
Yeah, so like most people don't even realize that, because I think my theory is that we live in such a like Cartesian, I think, therefore I am culture, that Western people and Western Christians find it hard to fathom growing in Christ not through the lens of their mind, but through the lens of their stomach.
Yeah.
So we're used to like, hey, read this book or listen to this podcast, or sit through this lecture or go to church and hear a sermon and you'll grow. We're not used to every Wednesday, don't eat. and give that time to prayer and getting in touch with your hunger for God and asking God to purify your body and your soul, like in order to grow. Like we don't even have a fathom for non-intellectual spiritual formation, but we're embodied creatures. And so I think that's, again, why the explosion in yoga right now and, body-based stuff. I think it's because there's this movement where culture is trying to correct that Cartesian kind of we're brains on legs and trying to get us back into our bodies. And Christians should lead the way in this. Like we have an embodied spirituality that is thousands of years old. I just read a fascinating thing arguing that yoga could possibly have been Christian in origin, that it doesn't exist in India until the 6th century, and that it was possibly Eastern Christians that introduced it to India. I have no idea if that's true. But it makes sense theologically, especially the Eastern tradition where there's the Jesus prayer and contemplative prayer, and breathing prayer is so core. My point is just there's a theology of the body that I think we're trying to walk people back into.
I came to taking transformative practices seriously through kind of some brokenness in my own life in my 30s. Because I remember reading Dallas Willard. About the same time, I would read Romans 7 and Romans 8, and I would get exasperated. Because Romans 7, describing the powerlessness that we experience, and then Romans 8 describing this different sort of life. I'd get to the end of Romans 8, and I would be frustrated with Paul because my next question would be, okay, tell me how.
Yes.
Right. And all I could get from good, well-meaning church people was, well, read your Bible and pray more. And it's like, that doesn't help me.
No, then you're down to willpower.
Right, exactly. And
which people say they don't believe that theologically, but often my theory is that every Christian pastor and church has a working theory of change, like how that we grow and mature. Most of the time it's unconscious, not conscious, unintentional, not intentional, and often haphazard and ineffective, not effective. But if you don't have a robust understanding of practice, community, inner healing, the Holy Spirit, whatever your working theory of change is, we have one that we've come up with, then often people's assumption is that the working theory is basically Bible study, inspiration, and willpower.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like hear a good sermon or read a good book, be inspired in your heart, and then just go do it.
Which is like motivation in kind of...
And people don't believe that theologically, but that's the actual working theory that I think a lot of people have.
Yeah.
And that's just a recipe for disillusionment.
And so it seems like even like when you describe, say, something like fasting, for me, I will hear people describe certain practices in an overly spiritualized or pietistic way that puts me off because it's like, I want to have a way to have these things described so that I can simultaneously hear you talk about fasting on Friday and Wednesday and know the research about the fast diet and that there's profound changes for the good for your health bodily and not reducing it to that on that side.
Where you're like fasting to like lose some weight and have a clear mind.
So not reducing it to, how I look in my genes, but also not reducing it to some sort of over-spiritualized thing. And somehow try to hold all that stuff together.
Yeah, theology of the body. Is so key.
Yeah. So how I'm intrigued with this notion of holding before a congregation, taking seriously a rule of life. I mean, we do a lot of that in our classes here at the university. I'm not familiar with the church around here that is saying what it means to be a part of this church is we're going to take seriously a rule of life. So how's that resonated with people there?
Well, you're swimming upstream, especially in a city like Portland, where I'm from, that is hyper-individualistic, hyper-anti-authoritarian. And
we don't know anything about hyper-individualism or hyper-anti-authoritarianism in the South.
Not at all in the South. And, there's that weird, and you would understand this better than me, all the Western ideas that go back to, Rousseau and Freud and all the people that basically perceive any form of external constraint as a form of oppression.
Right.
And that will just sabotage your growth into Christ-likeness like nobody's business. Because what is the New Testament? What is the lordship of Jesus, if not some kind of an external
Other than
constraint?
heteronomy, right. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So all that to say, it's been a long, slow journey for us. And you never lead with the practices or the discipline. You lead with the why behind, with the ache, So if I were just to lay out, hey, to be a part of this church means you do these 10 things on a weekly basis or whatever, I mean, people would be like, I'm out. What the heck? This is a cult. But if you lead with, most people are anxious, burned out. They know that they're addicted to their phone and the internet and Netflix, but they're trying to get off of it. They feel lonely, but yet they struggle in relationships and in actual intimacy and community in church, so on and so forth. I think you have to lead to that ache. So it's a lot of pastoral care that we've spent about 5 years cultivating with our church. COVID was actually a gift because it kind of accelerated our work to attempt to pastor our church into a rule of life. Because the moment it hit, everybody started to freak out. People lost all of their rhythms. You know what I mean? They were like going to work in their pajama pants. And there was all the soft pants, hard pants jokes that were going around, And so people were more open and porous to the idea of a rule of life. So we kind of laid out like a temporary rule of life right at the beginning of COVID for our church. And some of it was very practical, like limiting how often you read the news.
Yeah.
And it was all invitational. Everything we do is just like, we're inviting you into this. It's up to you. And I was shocked at how people just like almost leapt at it because, again, they were in a time of chaos. So there was actually a desire for order, as opposed to the opposite a number of years before. So that was really helpful. We did in-depth teaching on it. We've done so much teaching on this over 5 years. That's the gift of a church. You get to really take the people on a journey. And then what it's building up to, and it'll really start this coming year, will be a official kind of rule of life for our church, that every year there'll be a class for those that are new to the church. It's a city, so it's transient. That are people who are new to the church to kind of go on a condensed version of our journey into that rule of life, teaching on the practices, on the why behind it, on a working theory of change, how we understand that the human soul is formed and grown or shrunk over a lifetime. And then we'll hopefully have some spiritual directors or kind of spiritual guides that can meet with people to basically we'll have like a high-level rule of life that won't drill down. It'll have like Sabbath, or it'll have solitude, or it'll have scripture, but it won't have like X minutes a day or this time each morning. That'll all be like people following the invitations of Jesus where they're at in their journey, which can be totally different for a new mom who just became a Christian 3 months ago than it is to an empty nester who's been following Jesus for 50 years. They're going to have different like expressions, but the same basic rule. And then people kind of on an annual basis can revisit their rule of life. Communities at our church will kind of recommit to it, and that'll basically function as our form of membership. And then to be a leader in the church, you'll have to basically commit to this. This will be like, if you're going to be a leader in our church, this is the rule of life that from our lead pastor and elders all the way down, this is just how we follow Jesus in this city together.
Any pushback from leadership about being expected to subscribe to such?
Only ones that are grandfathered in. That's the pastoral. Yes, all sorts of pushback. But no, it's actually gone way better than we expected it to, and way less pushback than we expected. So that's the trick. Now, as long as everything's invitational, it's easier. The moment it's like, this is required of you to be and da-da-da-da-da. But I mean, if you don't have requirements on your leaders, what in the world is a leader in your church or your whatever? So there have to be boundaries. And the great, myth, I think, of the Protestant tradition or the evangelical tradition is that following Jesus is just about theology and ethics and not about lifestyle.
Yeah.
And, it's I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And, the attempt to have truth without way and not getting to the life is, I think, one of the great fallacies and there's much in the evangelical tradition I'm grateful for, but that's one of the great misses, I think.
So your book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, obviously is one very practical engagement with these sorts of questions.
It's basically an intro to spiritual formation that's sneaking into the Trojan horse of people's felt need of hurry and anxiety and burnout.
Yeah. So
just show you all my cards there.
Yeah. So
you think I'm just trying to make your life more relaxed. Actually, I'm trying to get you to follow Jesus.
Well, you quote, I think it was Dallas Willard saying to John Ortberg, when Ortberg asked him, what advice did he have? He said, you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. And you also use Carl Jung, hurry is not of the devil, hurry is the devil. So tell us about what you are trying to describe there. What's it been like for you learning to eliminate hurry?
Well, the nice thing is once you write a book, then that is permanently true of you and you never struggle with it ever again. That's the great, as you know, right?
Right.
David Brooks has that great line about how he's always trying to write himself into a better life. Yeah. And man, do I relate to that. If only spiritual formation was as simple as write a book about a subject and then it will be true of your character, you know? So I have definitely not arrived. I'm very much still on the journey. And in some sense, I'm the worst possible person to write a book about hurry, just because I am by nature, you know, type A, a little neurotic, OCD, all that kind of stuff, which kind of makes you the best person to write about it. Because I write out of my weakness, not out of my strength. I'm not a relaxed, kind of in the moment, naturally phlegmatic kind of personality. Yeah. So that means I have to just work at it a lot harder than somebody like my wife, who's very, you know, relaxed by nature. Yeah. When I was first exposed to that line, which was Willard's line to Ortberg, and actually there's two sentences there. The second one was, you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. The first one was, hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life in our day. Which is similar to the Carl Jung, you know, hurry isn't of the devil, it is the devil. Or I quote Corrie ten Boom in the book, if the devil can't make you sin, he'll make you busy. And when I first heard that, it was like a head scratcher for me. You know, on one hand, it was like part of my like rational brain said, what are you talking about, hurry? Like, I mean, I live in Portland, Oregon. We were recently named the least religious, not just least Christian, least religious city in all of the United States of America. I mean, it is, Lee, it is so far left. Every time I travel, like being here in Nashville, I'm just realize what a bubble I live in as far as the level of secularism, progressivism, post-Christianity that I just live around. We live right in the city that I'm around all of the time. And if you were to ask me prior to hearing that, like, what's the greatest challenge you face in following Jesus and pastoring people in a city like Portland? I don't know what I would have said, you know, Donald Trump or partisan politics or ideology or sexuality or whatever. But hurry would not have even what entered my mind or imagination. It would not have even made the list. But on the other hand, I had this like, you're a musician, right?
Only an amateur musician.
Well, we'll take amateur.
I get to be around a lot of pro musicians.
I know, you're in Nashville. The best word picture I can think of is like a tuning fork for the soul. You know, like if you think of a tuning fork, if you hit one, if you're close to it, like you feel your bone tremor a little bit. And as I understand music theory, musical notes are literally like woven into the fabric of creation. It's like gravity or E equals MC squared or whatever math theorem. Like it's there in the universe that God created. And if you access that reality via your acoustic guitar or your piano or your voice, then you can like harness it and do something beautiful and powerful with it. So I had this other saying where like my rational brain kind of thought, hurry's the great enemy. And then like my soul had this like tuning fork moment where it's like, I feel like I'm coming into contact with reality right now. It's like resonating with me deeply, you know? And the longer I've sat with that thesis, the more I've come to agree with it. And it's kind of intentionally an overstatement and provocative in a good way to kind of shock you into thinking about it. But I do think that hurry is kind of the issue underneath so many of the other issues, whether that be political polarization. I'm just shocked at the complexity of the world and the oversimplification of partisan politics. I'm like, do you understand how complex an issue like immigration is, or systemic racism is, or fill in the blank? These are like extraordinarily complex issues that don't often have clear solutions to the problems. But yet people talk about them as it's just this right, left, binary, us versus them, simple, good versus evil kind of thing. I'm like, man, this is complex. But in order to understand that complexity, it would take a lot of time, it would take humility, it would take compassion to hear another person's perspective. When you're in a hurry, you simply don't have the time, you know. So that's one of 1,000 issues right now that plague our society and our soul, of which I think hurry is an underlying cause.
Yeah, and it seems that increasingly for me, if I really have any interest in making a contribution to my own transformation and the good of my community, I increasingly think of attention along with intention as key, which we simply can't do when we're in a hurry.
Yeah. I think I tell this story in the book, but 5 years ago, before we basically re-architected and rebuilt our whole church around spiritual formation and practices and started to walk our church into a rule of life, I sat down before we started all of this initiative with our church with my therapist, who is also this like PhD, 70-something, like a bit of a legend where I'm from, just a literal brilliant guru kind of man and deep lover of Jesus, but deeply informed in the best of psychology. And I ran by him our whole working theory of change and our whole model of church about to embark on. I said, like, I want you to shred this. I want you to like talk to me as a clinical psychologist, like poke holes in all of this. We had this great conversation, and he mostly affirmed like our theory of change and our model of church. But then he just basically, he's very much a realist. He said, the number one problem you will face is time. And he said, most people in your church will never do this because it will take time. And his experience as a therapist after 40-something years or whatever of giving therapy was that most people are too busy to do the things they need to do to become healthy and whole people. I think he said, most people are too busy to live emotionally healthy and spiritually vibrant lives, was his line. The major obstacle to spiritual formation for most people, it's not a hard heart, it's not an obstinate spirit, it's not lack of Bible teaching. It is for most people just this, whether you want to call it hurry or busyness or digital distraction or lack of capacity for attention, it is this just life of speed that is literally incompatible, I think, with a life of prayer. You know, C.S. Lewis, I forget his name, but his spiritual director called hurry the death of prayer.
You're listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, and the Good Life, and we are most grateful to have you joining us. If you've not yet done so, subscribe today to the Tokens podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, CastBox, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. We do love hearing from you. Like we heard recently from Matt Steinhauer, many kind words about matters ranging from politics and religion to our interview with Amy Jill Levine, who came to the podcast by way of Nashville Public Radio Sunday afternoon broadcast. Many thanks, Matt. And we invite all of you listening as well to join in if you're in Middle Tennessee on Nashville Public Radio on Sunday afternoons. You can email us at podcast@tokenshow.com. Also, remember you can sign up for our email list and find out how to join us for a live event, all at tokenshow.com. Please do come join us in Nashville. This is our interview with John Mark Comer. Coming up, we'll hear more about what he calls his church's working theory of change and how he applies such a theory to spiritual formation in his newest book, Live No Lies. Part 2 in just a moment. Welcome back to Tokens and our interview with John Mark Comer. So, summarize for us the theory of change that you
I don't have a way to do it quick. So, point 1, spiritual formation is not a Christian thing or religious thing, it's a human thing. To be human is to be dynamic, not static. We're all being formed. We're all becoming a person. The question is not, are you becoming someone, but who are you or becoming? What are you becoming?
Yep, great.
So that's premise 1, that you're already being formed. Premise 2 is all Christian spiritual formation is counter formation, because we're already being formed by the world. So Romans chapter 12, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So Paul is saying we don't start with a blank slate and then through discipleship to Jesus become more like Jesus. We start with deformation. We are already have been and are being formed, in his case by Rome, in our case by the United States of America and the internet, whether that's the right or the left or some amalgamation of the two. So whatever our formation into the image of Jesus is, it's counterformation. We don't live in the Garden of Eden. We live in a post-Eden world, you know. So
there's some sort of stream of culture that's occurring that's not the stream towards which we wish to end up.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
And thus it takes intentionality to
intentionality, counterformation to offset. So point 3, we basically have 2 spiritual formation paradigms that we don't have good language for it yet, but one we just call unintentional spiritual formation and the other intentional, meaning unintentional spiritual formation is just our best attempt to understand how we are currently being formed with no intention on our part, no rule of life, no spiritual disciplines. You just wake up in the morning and you go about your day. You just be an American, you be a college student, be a mom, be a whatever. This is how you are being formed. And so if you can imagine, it's hard to say it verbally, but if you imagine a triangle at the top is stories that we believe. So this idea that we all live from narratives, that we're narrative animals. The human brain is wired at a neurobiological level to make meaning of our world. And these stories, these narratives about what is good and beautiful and true, they deeply shape how we live. So, if you believe that we're human beings created in the image of God, we're created male and female, sexuality is ultimately not about pleasure or even production. It's about some kind of communion and contribution to increase and fill the earth, to breed friendship, to deepen intimacy. That's going to shape how you express your gender and your sexuality. If you believe, on the other hand, another narrative, and it is a narrative, an interpretation of science and history, that we're just animals, we're just another species, this whole thing is one glorious or not so glorious accident, that sexuality is just about survival of the fittest and propagation of the species, and now that the world is overpopulated, we can jettison any intention of biology and it's just become about pleasure now. It's just psychological, biological release. That's going to deeply shape how you express your gender and sexuality. You're going to be living into, those are just two options, but one of those narratives that are going to deeply shape what you do with your body, what you do with your sexuality, what you do with romantic relationships. So stories we believe. Second would be habits. All the stuff about, Charles Duhigg, Power of Habit, how the things that we do something to us, that habits, whether it's something as simple as watching the news before bed or doom scrolling on Instagram or going for a run, these all do something to the formation of our inner person. Good, bad, or neutral, they're forming us. Third would be, the other point of the triangle would be relationships. We're tribal creatures, we're herd creatures. We become like the people that we are around. You sound like a Southerner, I sound like a West Coast boy. That's because you grew up in the South, I grew up in California. So that's a simple analogy, but you're going to dress like, think like, vote like, live like, express yourself like your tribe, the kind of relationships of people that you're in, whether that's a political tribe, ethnic tribe, your coworker, your city, your demographic, your class, or some amalgamation of all of that. Finally, if you imagine in the middle of the triangle, we're formed by our environment. Like Nashville, like it's so clear just being here from Portland, because Portland and Nashville are so different. There's a stereotype to a what do you call a Nashvilleite? Nashvilleian? Nashvilleian, or a Portlander, and of course those are caricatures, but you just see the cultural currents that are forming you into a specific kind of person by living here. Versus, the very similar currents, but that are forming me into a specific kind of person by living where I live, And finally, this happens, if you can imagine below that triangle, over time, which is what makes it so incremental and subtle, and through experience, whether that's a tragedy or a trauma, or of course your family of origin would be the primary one, or success, or any number of things. Being born one ethnicity or another ethnicity, whatever these experiences are, they deeply shape us. So that's unintentional spiritual formation. So if you can, it's hard to do this audibly, but if you can imagine, whenever I teach on this, I have the slides up. If you can imagine that, counter all of that is what we call intentional spiritual formation, which is just a bad way of saying following Jesus on purpose. And so counter the stories that we believe is truth, or the role of like the renewal of the mind of Christ, the role of teaching, why I think Jesus came as a rabbi or a teacher, and why teaching and preaching are still crucial for the future of the church, whether that's a sermon at church on Sunday or you teaching a class of undergrads, Counter our habits are the practices of Jesus, or the spiritual disciplines, where we take on these habits that are based on the life and teachings of Jesus. And the gift of habits is they get into us not just through our mind and our prefrontal cortex, but through our limbic system. They actually shape like what we love. And Jamie K. Smith's all his stuff on You Are What You Love, and the role of habit and how it actually shapes what we love and what we long for. I mean, that is absolutely crucial to understand. Third, encounter our relationships is community, where we take intentional steps into relationship with other Christians who call us up into higher levels of holiness and surrender to Jesus. Counter our environment, Nashville or Portland or the internet, wherever we live, would be the Holy Spirit, as we are baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And we attempt to live, like Jesus said, through abiding in such a way that God becomes our predominant environment, that we live in a God-saturated universe where the Father is in the air all around us, and we really live from that place. And so we're primarily formed into the kingdom of God atmosphere as opposed to the kingdom of man atmosphere around us. Same thing, this happens over time, which is double entendre. Time, how much time we put into following Jesus, and over years and decades and a lifetime. And finally, not just through experience, but through suffering. which the very thing that we Westerners and most people in general avoid like the plague, is the primary crucible, all the great ones tell us, of how we are formed and forged into Christ-like people of love. So basically, a short way of saying that, we're formed through teaching, practice, community, all by the Holy Spirit. This happens over time and through suffering.
Remarkable. Fascinating. Thank you.
You asked for the short version. I just gave you a bad short sermon is what I gave you.
Thank you for that. No, that's immensely helpful and fruitful for thinking about at much more length.
My point isn't so much that we have the right working theory of chains. It's that you probably have one and don't know it.
Right.
So figure out what it is, and then with a lot of humility and curiosity, keep like refining it as you follow Jesus or lead or whatever. Like I grew up in the evangelical church. They never would have said this. And if I articulated back, they would say, this is heresy. But what I imbibed was a working theory that if I had to write it up was information plus inspiration plus willpower equals change. And that is a recipe for disillusionment, not for growth and maturity.
Well, and it also goes back to what you said your psychologist friend said to you, in that most people don't ever take any time to allow themselves to consider how may I go about changing.
Yes.
Right. And this reminds me of one of the lines I love from Alistair McIntyre. He says the nature of a good life is a life spent seeking in the nature of a good life.
Yes. Yes.
And it's this sort of iterative process where we're taking seriously our lives, right? And we're taking seriously what sorts of practices, habits, disposition, skills, narratives, community change us and lead us to who we are becoming, and it holds before us. That's one of the big critiques McIntyre made of the Enlightenment, was that we've taken away any sort of teleological picture of what it means to be human. We don't have that picture of the why question that you raised a minute ago. For what and for what purpose and why are we trying to do life, right?
So then the default purpose just becomes pleasure.
Yes, or whatever the marketers sell us.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and so we're always being captive by something if we're not paying attention. Right?
Yeah, that's I think the great myth of the Enlightenment, is that we're these autonomous, rational selves.
Yes.
Rather than what any scientist or Christian theologian would tell you, which is that you are a beautiful, wonderful image of God person who is also easily emotionally manipulated.
Right.
Completely social creature, like follow the herd mentality, easily capable of self-delusional thinking, which is science and scripture both align on that point, but it's so against the Western narrative. I'm this rational, autonomous self. I'll just think for myself. You do you. The voter is always right. People know best. But
like you say, most of us know better than that when you spend much time paying attention to it.
If you're honest.
If you're honest, because it's clearly the marketers know that.
Yes.
Even though some of the Milton Friedmans of the world might not think that way.
Well, I think the conspiracy theory read of the Founding Fathers and why that persists is because people in power want us to think that.
Yes.
So that we're blind to them manipulating us, whether it's an advertiser who's trying to get us to buy a new pair of Nikes, or a politician is trying to get us to vote for whatever party, or a guru is trying to get us to buy their book or whatever. People have a vested interest in us believing the delusion that we're not following anybody. We're just deciding for ourselves.
Yeah.
And so it's either follow Jesus or live by my own wisdom. When the reality is, if you're not following Jesus, you're following somebody or something else. But we don't want to believe that, which makes us easy to manipulate.
Yeah, right. Give us a short list of some of your favorite practices for eliminating hurry.
Oh, there's 4 in the book that I name, not because they're the best per se. They're just the ones that have been the most helpful to me. And they're also, all 4 are ones that I did not grow up in. And that's not a critique of my family of origin. I have amazing parents who did a phenomenal job, but they just was not a part of the church tradition I was in. So they are Sabbath, silence and solitude, simplicity and slowing. So Sabbath, an entire day set aside to stop and rest and delight and worship. Silence and solitude, regular time built in where you are just alone with yourself and with God and prayer. and kind of free of any external inputs other than from God himself and maybe from Scripture. 3, simplicity, or some people will call that simple living or minimalism or whatever, but simplifying not just your possessions and your wardrobe, but even your activities and your commitments down to really live in alignment with your deepest desires and to make discipleship to Jesus, and in particular prayer and community, really the center, the yellow line in the middle that is the road of your life. And finally, slowing, that's language from Richard Foster and John Ortberg, who talk about slowing actually as a spiritual discipline for the modern age. They mean exactly what it sounds like, actually just slowing down and doing things slower. That they would say this is a spiritual discipline in theory is anything that you see in the life of Jesus. So anything that you see in Matthew, you could argue that mountain climbing is a spiritual discipline because Jesus went up to the top of mountains. So it's anything that you see in the life of Jesus that you're trying to just kind of incorporate into your own life, and the thought that maybe this is some kind of a mechanism for the Spirit of Jesus to form you to become like Jesus. And so, if you pay attention to Jesus, he just was not hurried. Willard was once asked, describe Jesus in one word, and he thought about it for a minute, and he said, relaxed. And if you just think about how Jesus is so present to the moment, if you just read through the 4 Gospels and take a short tally of how many of the stories in the Gospels are unplanned, unscheduled interruptions. So almost all of them. There's very few like 4 p.m. on Thursday, September 28th, spit in man's eyes and red mud on him and make for a great story a couple decades later in this biography. No, it's just like that was Jesus responding to an interruption. C.S. Lewis had that great line that how you respond to an interruption is who you really are, which is like dagger to the heart for me, for a hurried person.
Say
like
that one
me.
more time.
How you respond to an interruption is who you really are.
Yeah, man, that's pretty...
because you're not performing.
That's great,
that
and
point.
that's awful.
It's awful. I hate that saying. Darn you, C.S. Lewis. Oh, darn you. Lord have mercy. So slowing is basically, it's almost like gamifying your life where you intentionally kind of live analog and live at a slower pace in an attempt to kind of reset your nervous system and rehabituate your body to the pace of Jesus, which is the pace of love.
Yeah.
So it could be something as simple as getting in a slow line, driving in the slow lane, or just keeping your phone away from you, or not multitasking. It can be really simple. Taking a walk.
Do you talk in there about testing about whether you're in the fastest line in the grocery store? Don't you mention that in there?
I do. That's maybe the least popular line in my entire book.
I hated you when you mentioned that one because I thought, doesn't everybody, everyone with a sane mind does that?
Well, okay, so in the book, I talk about, this is a secular concept, but hurry sickness is like actually in the psychological literature. And there's a Stanford professor, Philip Zimbardo, who wrote this book on hurry sickness, and he has 3 signs to self-diagnose. And it's 1, you get into the shortest line at the checkout line. 2, you're at a red light, you're coming up to a red light and you change lanes to get into 3 cars in one lane, 2 cars in another,
Check.
You change lane. 3, you multitask to the point that you forget one of the tasks. Not to play armchair psychologist, but I'm pretty sure we all have hurry sickness. You're like, wait, isn't that just living?
Yeah. Well, and I shouldn't even tell this one on the podcast, but one of the things that I do to be able to tell whether or not I'm going to get through the green light is I learned years ago that you can watch the crossing sign the countdown over there, and you know how much you have to punch it to get through the yellow light.
Then you go to the hand.
That's right.
110%.
Yes, yeah. So, I mean,
my point is, we think that's normal.
Yes.
But it's actually not normal. It's a recent
Well, it may be
phenomenon.
Normal statistically in our hurried, sick
It's not
world.
normal historically.
Yeah. For me, I mean, I remember one time years ago, I was doing some therapy work, and this therapist said to me, probably like the 3rd or 4th visit, he said, "You're pretty obsessed with productivity, aren't you?" And I said, "How did you know that?" And he said, "Because you always show up just about 2 minutes late to your appointment." And it was like, yeah, I mean, this is what I do, is I've got every moment kind of planned out and in a hurry. And so, for me, just your thing about being slow, I've noticed a lot of this stuff can be done in very simple ways, as one would hope, right? In that if I will find myself literally slowing down my pace just 20%, it allows me to pay more attention to what I'm doing.
Yes.
Getting rid of a cell phone has been huge for me in this regard because it requires me to not get in a hurry to tell people by text message, or if I'm going to engage with somebody, I get to plan to engage with them And then when I'm with them, and I'm not distracted by the phone. That's been a huge practice for me in learning to slow down and simplify.
Unbelievable. May your tribe increase.
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't do it by any virtuous ends. I broke my phone, and I tried 3 times to get it fixed. And by that point, I decided, well, I think I'll try this a bit. And it's been wonderful. I think I'm 3 years in. But one thing that made me realize how powerful it is, I was a year into it, and I had my last phantom buzz in my pocket a year out from not having a cell phone. And I just realized how powerful that thing is psychologically for me.
I mean, my book is not about like work productivity. It's about formation and following Jesus. But I did a lot of reading and research, and I have a lot of thoughts about work productivity. And
because you like Cal Newport, right?
I love Cal Newport.
I love Cal Newport as well. One of these days I want to interview Cal Newport.
Yeah, he's a great interview, by the way. I've listened to a podcast or 2 by him. But the myths that I think type A, career-minded people believe is that activity equals productivity.
Yeah, and he just debunks
I think he, in his own way, not through the angle of formation or becoming a person of love, just through the angle of making a lot of impact in your job, would argue the exact opposite. That if you slow down, if you focus, if you eliminate distraction, if you say no, if you kind of simplify, and really, you'll actually have more of an impact. There's the Greg McKeown, who's written about this too. He has the book Essentialism. He has a new one out. He writes about, I think it's called the Pareto Principle, that 20% of your work gives 80% of your impact.
Right.
And so we just waste all of our energies doing all this stuff that actually doesn't really move the ball forward on our career per se.
No, I mean, when I read Cal Newport 5, 6, 7 years ago, whenever it was the first time, and I revamped my work according to his deep work stuff, my life is much more simple, and yet I'm being immensely more productive.
Yes.
And I'm less stressed at it.
Yep.
And then 2 or 3 years ago, I reread it along with a book called Rest. And Rest is about doing case studies of famous people, intellectuals like Charles Darwin. Darwin, if you looked at Darwin's daily schedule, he would get up in the morning and he would work in a focused way for 90 minutes or so. Then he'd go for a long walk, and he'd do a little bit of correspondence. And then he'd go have lunch, and he'd do another long walk, and then he'd tend to his farm animals or something. And then he'd come back and work another hour and a half late afternoon. The dude wrote 33 books in his life, and one of which was the most important book in the 19th century, right?
Yeah.
And so you look at his life and you think, he's not doing anything. He's lazy, but it's like, no, he's immensely productive by not being distracted and by learning these rhythms of rest and simplicity. So changing gears just a touch, raised evangelical, but you and I have had at least enough conversation offline about your interest in the Anabaptists. A quick church history intrusion here. If you're not familiar with the Anabaptists, they were the so-called radical version of the 16th century Protestant Reformation. Radical in that they took some of the emphases on reform to what some thought an extreme, but which they thought central to Christian discipleship. For example, practices like nonviolence and a refusal to take oaths, both grounded in the Sermon on the Mount. These were trademark teachings for many of the Anabaptists. Why called Anabaptists? Ana simply means again, and so the name Anabaptist was a label given them by their detractors. They rejected the practice of infant baptism, believing that Christian discipleship ought to entail a voluntary adult choice because the stakes were so high. But this practice threatened the nominally Christian identity of all of society that was propagated through infant baptism. If so-called everyone is a Christian and everyone is Christian through the mechanism of infant baptism, then any suggestion to discard the practice of infant baptism, alongside practices of nonviolence and love of enemies, these were all seen as a radical threat to the socio-political religious status quo. Consequently, the Anabaptists were literally hunted down and executed in cruel and dehumanizing ways by both some of the mainline Protestants and Roman Catholic authorities. How do you see that tradition as being potentially much needed at this juncture in American church history?
Well, I mean, disclaimer would be I probably have a romanticized vision of the Anabaptists. You know?
All church traditions are screwed up in some way or the other.
I know. And it's easy to look back at them and just talk about the great, you
Right.
know, that they gave. But a couple of things that I think broad strokes were definitive about the Anabaptist movement. I'm not sure they still are, but were, and I think we need to recapture for our moment. One would be its commitment to obey the teachings of Jesus. I don't think it was intentional, but something about the Reformation kind of separated theology of the atonement from the Sermon on the Mount. And that is a bad decision. That is like a game of would you rather I have no interest in playing. So the Anabaptists focus on the teachings of Jesus, the four Gospels, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus as a teacher, not just as the atonement for die for, and which I think is a very limited understanding of what atonement even is, but as actually making space for us to live a whole new way in a new community in the kingdom of God. I mean, I just never grew up really hearing much of anything about the Sermon on the Mount. When I would hear it taught on, it was basically, this is Jesus showing you that you can never possibly measure up to God's high standards, so you have to just trust in his death on the cross. I mean, what a gross misreading of Jesus, rather than this is the most precious gift in all of human history. This is the way. This is the path to life, you know? So that I'm really grateful for. Secondly, its emphasis on recapturing communal life together, community life around a table. In some of the Anabaptist tradition, Lord's Supper as a meal, you know, not as a sacrament. Well, maybe theologically as a sacrament, but expressed as a meal around a community, around a table, which is how we practice the Lord's Supper at our church, as a full meal with our communities. So that's been revolutionary for me. Third would be, I think, its refusal to marry political power with the gospel of Jesus. It's just absolute refusal to participate in political power plays or military violence. That is still revolutionary, whether you're on the right or the left. I mean, it's just as revolutionary on the left, because the statism is even stronger, I think, in some ways on the left. It's just different expression. So I think that, you know, I just finished reading Tom Holland's book, Dominion. Have you been hearing about that?
Yeah, it's on my list to read, and also a hopeful interview.
Yeah, oh, that'd be amazing. It's extraordinary, but long, and it's hard to read. You're both like inspired by the Christian tradition and like thoroughly humiliated at the same time. But my take, it just deepened my convictions around nonviolence. 9 out of 10 of the cringe-worthy moments in the history of the church are when the church decided to get in bed with military violence and political power. Like 9 out of 10 of the times you're like, what in the world? You just ruined this move of God. You just sabotaged this move of the Spirit. You just decimated the image of Jesus and the reputation and the witness of the church. Almost always it was to do with political and military compromise, I think, is the best word for it. So those three things I think I find deeply inspiring. And those are pretty broad strokes. You know, I don't know many people that would say, no, we shouldn't get back to the teachings of Jesus, discipleship to Jesus, life in community, eating meals together, and not compromising with the world. Most people would agree with that, but I think the Anabaptist tradition, at least for its heyday, did a really good job holding to that.
I wonder if it's easier for you to say those kinds of things to Christians in Portland than it is to say them to Christians in Nashville.
I think it depends on the example. I think it's just as hard. It just depends. Like, I could talk about militarism, and not that many people in my church would be offended. But if I dared to suggest that the best way to do justice might not be through a socialist vision of America, I would get crucified. Because it's still, the state is the solution to all of our problems. Now, that might be, I mean, a large, expansive state welfare system. I'm pretty agnostic politically. I'm probably, to a fault, don't have strong opinions. But I'm always trying to help Christians understand that if you're a follower of Jesus, you have a responsibility that if you neglect it will literally be sabotaging the movement of the Spirit in your own heart and in your own community to care for the poor. to be a Christian is to care for the poor. So where we can disagree is what's the best way to care for the poor. Is it through a federal government that mails a check to the poor? Is it through high accountability local community where you're bringing the poor into your home community around your table? Is it a local neighborhood-based kind of organization that's a partnership between the faith-based community and the government or whatever? We can disagree about how. Really, that's a question about whether or not the government is the best vehicle to do justice, or whether or not the church is, or whether or not, as most moderates would agree, some combination of the two is, you know? But I'm trying to help people understand the disagreement is about the how, it's not about the what. So as far as the how, like I just let people much smarter than me to help us figure out the best way to do justice. But my point is, I think the statism, the idolatry of the state as the future, as the source of our security, our safety, and the future of human prosperity, I think it's just as strong, if not stronger, on the left as on the right. It's just going to be different examples. So if I'm down here and I were preaching against military violence or Christian nationalism or talking about racial justice, you get all this pushback. In Portland, if you're talking about all sorts of other things, you'd get massive pushback. Yeah. It's just different issues, but I think it's the same psychology.
So talk to us about some about your new book, Live No Lies.
The whole reason I'm on this show, an hour in, buy my book, Live No Lies.
So give us an overview of the sorts of lies that you're particularly concerned with.
Yeah, well, let me back up and put it this way. So I wrote this book called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry that we've been talking about. And then I have this new book that is at some level like a radical departure. You know, it's not about like slowing down and becoming a person of love. It's about the world, the flesh, and the devil, this ancient Christian paradigm of the three enemies of the soul. So a large chunk of it is about Satan. And so I'm so like on pins and needles, kind of dreading the release. Like, wait, what happened to the guy that was all about like Sabbath and slowing down and becoming a person of compassion? Now he's just writing about Satan and like the culture wars and the sex revolution and Christian nationalism. What happened to that poor guy? But actually, the two very much go together because my pastoral heart, I don't think there's a right way to be a pastor or a right theory of pastoring. I think we need all sorts of different gifts in the church. There's all different aspects of pastoring that are really important. Social justice, community organization, catalyzing new vision. Those are all really important things. What I get out of bed in the morning for is not putting on another Sunday gathering or starting a new initiative. It's really formation. It's like I'm just really interested. I think that's why I read so much psychology and social science. I'm really interested in the growth and the expansion and the healing of the soul. And I think ultimately Jesus is the ultimate source of that. And that is my driving passion. And it comes out of my own pain. Like, you know, what's the saying in writing? We study what pains us. By personality, I am not a naturally nice and happy person. So, you know, if you ever do the Myers-Briggs, have you ever seen this where you put in your Myers-Briggs type, which if you're not familiar with that, it's a theory of personality based on Carl Jung's work. There's 16 personality types based on letters. If you put yours in, mine's INTJ, and you can like Google that and a famous movie, and it will show you like what character you are in the movie. I never do it anymore because I'm always like the evil genius. Always. So like in Star Wars, I'm not even Darth Vader because he comes around in the end. I'm like the Emperor. I'm Palpatine. In Harry Potter, I'm he who must not be named. I am like, in all the famous ones, I'm like Stalin, Lenin, all the utopian communist genocidal maniacs. Like that's my personality type. So I'm just not naturally nice or happy by personality. And I am so captivated by Jesus of Nazareth, by the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and by the best of the Christian tradition, and by Jesus's centering of love as at the heart of God himself. The nature of who God is, and at the telos of the human condition is not happiness, it's not survival, it's not political utopianism, it's becoming people of love and forming communities of agape. That to me, like, you have to live from a worldview. I literally do not know of a better worldview to live by or a more captivating one. So I'm really interested in that. I'm really interested in formation. And I'm really interested as a pastor in not just my own formation, but the formation of other Christians in Western culture. What does this look like when you have an iPhone and you live in Portland or Nashville or whatever? And the reason I wrote both of these books, which at a surface level feel totally different, are because the two major obstacles that I see that keep people from even going on the journey of formation or discipleship or the growth of the soul, whatever you want to call it, are one, hurry, busyness, overload. People literally just do not have the time to follow Jesus. And two, people living with secular assumptions from the right or from the left or both about the telos of life, the good, the beautiful, and the true, that keep them from even wanting to habituate the teachings of Jesus into their life. Why would you want to become the kind of person? Jesus at the end said, teach people to obey what I have commanded you. Why would you want to learn to obey what Jesus commanded around, say, sexuality, if you are living with the secular assumption that sexual self-expression and sexual hedonism is key to living a happy and satisfying life? That is a secular assumption about life that is contrary to the life of Jesus, who never had sex, and the teachings of Jesus. So unless if we come to agree with Jesus' vision of what will lead us to the good life, we will never even go on the journey of how to habituate that into our own life. You know, it's the Ignatius of Loyola line, who I quote in the book, founder of the Jesuit order, who defines sin as unwillingness to trust that what God wants for me is only my deepest happiness. And he didn't mean that in like a modern Christian self-help way. He meant that all temptation at its root is a temptation to believe a lie, to believe an illusion about reality. This is the Garden of Eden story. This is the serpent personified there, whether that's history or myth or some amalgamation of the two, saying basically, if you want to be happy, don't do what God is saying to do. Don't accept his definition of good and evil. Listen to the voice in your own head and your own heart and follow what you want. That will lead you to happiness. And in the end, it leads to death, not to life.
Yeah.
And that's still happening today.
Yeah, I typically tell my students that I kind of surprise them and suggest that maybe happiness is the point of life, but it's a rightfully defined happiness.
Exactly.
Right? And it's the happiness of Irenaeus, the glory of God, the human being fully alive, or it's the happiness of Aquinas, the happiness that we experience in the beatific vision and friendship with God and can get a foretaste of now in friendship with others and practicing the virtues and so forth.
It's not the dopamine hit of pleasure, happiness, which is actually addiction in the early stages.
But even the rightfully defined happiness can even still give us a rightfully defined way even of enjoying the dopamine hits too.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. Absolutely. So I completely agree.
Yeah, so I tell them that, you know, our problem is not desire. Our problem in the great Christian tradition is disordered desire or inordinate desire.
Yes.
And it's having the desires rightly ordered, which only comes through the kind of practices you're talking about, that we can begin to have, to lean into what it might be to experience this rightfully defined happiness.
Yeah, and if you think about, that's where even this Anabaptist nonviolent guy, Augustine, is still so helpful there on, the problem isn't that we don't love, it's that we either love the wrong things or the right things in the wrong order. It's disordered desire that's at the root of our problem.
And he also helps us, going back to what we were saying earlier about the myth of the autonomous individual who's not whipped and tossed about by desire. Augustine would have looked at that and said, that's crazy, but there's always power at play in our social...
I don't like what people have done with Augustine, but as a general rule, I love Augustine.
There's much to learn
there's
there.
so much more good than bad. Unfortunately, we got just war theory and theological determinism that came out of that. But
and probably some obsessiveness about sex that also didn't help us maybe in certain ways. But anyway.
But man.
Well, I look forward to getting to read your new book and grateful for that as well.
Thanks, Lee.
So on the way out here, and you're talking, let's say, to people who, generally speaking, have been much more interested in the good Protestant obsession with knowing things more as key to living a good life or transformation. Give us 3 simple practices of simplicity or leaning into what you're pointing us to that you would say, start here.
Well, I don't want to keep it at too theoretical of a level, but one way to frame it on the way out is just to think that whatever the knowing is that you want to get into your life and your body, it has to be habituated in community and by the Spirit. So Willard, his very shorthand, this is much simpler than the long, complex, convoluted thing I gave you on a working theory of change. He had a very simple one he called VIM, I'm sure you're familiar with it, which is an acronym for Vision, Intention, Means. And he said for any human change, from something as simple as losing 5 pounds after Christmas to, overcoming an addiction to sex or, whatever, it requires 3 things. First, it requires vision. You have to have a vision of a different way to be human. It could be something as a vision of yourself 5 pounds skinnier, or your vision of yourself able to run 5 miles, or a vision of yourself as a loving person and not an angry person. Then you have to have a moment of intention. You have to decide in your heart that you will do whatever it takes to become that kind of a person. I have visions through advertising. I have visions of myself in a different way of life constantly. Myself wearing this outfit, myself driving this car, myself, with a 6-pack abs or whatever, myself on the paleo diet, all sorts of visions of the theoretical me out there that I look at and shrug like, because now that would cost too much money, that would take too much time, that would be too much effort, that's not really my style, because I've never had a moment of intention where I decide, okay, I will do whatever it takes to become that kind of a person. But you're still not done. And this is where most Christian thinking and most pastoral preaching falls flat. Vision and intention aren't enough. If all you have is like, I want to do this and I desire it, I say yes, then you're back to the information plus inspiration plus willpower equals change, which does not work except on very small changes in your life, tiny changes. Willpower works great when it works. It just doesn't work very often. So you need what he called means, which are just like small practical habits or practices or spiritual disciplines to get something like that into your life. So, and they need to be doable. What's the SMART goal? You know what I mean? Like they need to be things that are accessible, that are spiritually realistic for where you're at. If you're a single mom with a 3-year-old kid, you probably shouldn't start with like a 40-day fast. You know what I mean? You should probably start with, I'm going to read a psalm every morning. You know what I mean? Just start there, where you're at without the spiritual idealism or spiritual utopianism. So vision intention means whether you're trying to lose 5 pounds or become a person of love in Jesus. And I think a new paradigm would be whenever we have some kind of a vision, maybe it's we read a book, maybe it's you listen to a podcast like this, maybe you have a moment in church, and then you have this moment of intention. We're like, I want that. Always be thinking of what small practical steps could I take to move from theory to practice, to habituate this into my body. So maybe you hear a sermon on Philippians 4 about rejoicing in the Lord and becoming a joyful person, not an anxious person. That's great, but if that just stays at an aspirational willpower level, it'll never transform your life. So you need vision, intention, you need means. So maybe just this coming week, every single morning when you get up, first thing, write down 3 things that you're grateful for. Like that's anybody can do that. That is within the capacity of almost all of our willpower. And if we do that, maybe if we do it in the right way, with the right intention, it could open us up to the Spirit's power. And that's what spiritual disciplines do. And Willard was so helpful there. They are habits or practices that we can do with our own willpower that set the deepest part of us before God, that let Him do by the Spirit's power, but we could never accomplish through direct effort. So my willpower is not, I'm at the point in my discipleship to Jesus, in my marriage and my parenting, where my problem is not lack of information or wisdom. Like I was joking with some friends about parenting a couple hours ago. We're like, I know all the things now that I'm supposed to do as a dad. For the most, not all of them, but most of them. My problem is I'm just not godly or mature or emotionally regulated enough to do them. So my problem is not that I know it's wrong to shame my son and act controlling toward him when he does something that I think is dangerous. I know that's terrible. I know that has the opposite effect on him I want him to have. My problem is I'm not emotionally or spiritually mature enough to discipline myself when I hear some crazy thing, when he comes home with, black nail polish all over his nails. And I'm like, and I like slip into like horrible dad mode or whatever. My problem isn't knowledge. My problem is actually my body.
Right.
So what are practices that we could move? Otherwise, I'm just going to be willpower, try to be less controlling with my son. Flip that. How could I form some kind of a spiritual discipline or practice that is inside my capacity? So maybe that's every Friday afternoon, I'll take my son out for coffee, and we'll have a nice conversation together. I can do that. That's in my willpower.
Right.
That then creates space for the Spirit of God to do something in our relationship, in me. Let me listen, let me attend. So willpower is great for forming a rule of life and practices. It's horrible for actually like living the Sermon on the Mount. But if you can set yourself before God in community over a long time, you can let the Spirit of God transform you into the kind of person who naturally lives Matthew 5, 6, and 7.
Yeah, that's a lovely way to end. And I think, too, I was thinking how that fits so well with, for example, the agrarian metaphor of something like the fruit of the Spirit. And you've got two things being held together there, right? You have, it's the work of God, but it's also us participating in the cultivation of.
Yes.
And so it's both of those being held together that's so crucial in all of what you just described.
And you know all the history there that, Galatians 5, fruit of the Spirit, is Paul's take on John 15, abide in the vine. And that's where rule of life language comes from. That word rule, regula in Latin, literally means a straight piece of wood. It's where we get the English words ruler, or regular, or regulation. And a lot of linguists, not all, but think it was the word used for a trellis in a vineyard. And that was just a word picture. They said, all right, if the way we bear the fruit of the Spirit is through abiding in the vine, well, think about a vine. A vine, in order to bear the fruit that it's capable of, needs to have a trellis underneath it to lift it up off the ground and get it away from wild animals, predators, disease, damage, to get it more light and air and rain, and to index the growth in the right direction. Otherwise, it will bear a fraction of the fruit that it's capable of. So ancient Christians said, we need a regula, we need a trellis. If abiding in Jesus is how we grow to bear much fruit, we need some kind of a support structure to build our life off of that really makes abiding in Jesus the center of it. And so they made that a rule of life, just this set of practices and habits and relational rhythms that create space for God to grow us into people of love.
Been talking to John Mark Comer, founding pastor of Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon, on his new book, Live No Lies, and a former book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, and all manner of good things of life and living and pastoring. Thanks so much, John Mark. It's been a delight to be with you.
Thanks for having me on.
You've been listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, and the Good Life. Loads of overlap between some of the material in this interview with John Mark and other episodes you might want to check out, like Professor Mark McMinn on What Hath Christianity to Do with Psychology, or Diana Ostreich on her experience as a combat veteran coming to practice and advocate nonviolence, or Eugene Cho on the dangerous combination of Christian faith and the quest for socio-political coercive power. Remember, you can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, CastBox, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. If you've got feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Email us, text, or attach a voice memo, and send to the address podcast@tokenshow.com. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this podcast possible. Executive producer and manager Christy Bragg of Bragg Management. Co-producer Jacob Lewis of Great Feeling Studios. Associate producers Ashley Bain, Tom Anderson, and Brad Perry. Engineer Carriot Harmon. Music beds by Zach and Maggie White and Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening, and peace be unto thee. The Tokens Podcast is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.